See if there's the right volume. Tay, could you turn this down just a smidge? I don't want to blow everybody out. There we go. Hey, it's so great to see you guys and have you here. You may have noticed I set up fewer tables because I wanted you to be closer today. So hopefully that doesn't creep you out too much. Especially my wife. Doesn't creep out my wife. Hey, so here's the story on tonight. If this is your first time with us, just so you kind of know, normally we have a guy named Joel that does music, and he's a wonderful, wonderful guy. He and his wife went to Sun Valley for the weekend, which is great. And I tried to find someone to fill in, and didn't have a lot of luck. And so middle of the week, I thought, you know what? Let's just punt, and we're gonna roll with this, and this will be okay. So I got a couple of different kind of things planned, and it's going to be kind of an interactive thing, so hopefully you've come prepared to be nice to the people at the table you're at and talk to them a little bit. So anyway, we're glad you're here. And one other thing I wanted to mention as well. A couple years ago, we got this grant. This is kind of a longer story than probably more information than you need to know. But they gave us a bunch of money to get some promo stuff, and we didn't know what to do with the money, so we got a whole bunch of sweatshirts. And I've been holding on to these sweatshirts forever and not sure what I was going to do with them. We gave them away for a while. We sold them for a while. And then this summer I thought, first frost that we have, I'm going to bring those things out. I'm going to give them to everybody who shows up to church. So back over on the front row there, yes, you guys, yes. If you need a sweatshirt, if it's cold, the official CrossPoint, Sarah will model them for you, yes. The official CrossPoint sweatshirt, a little hoodie we got, yes. There you go, beautiful. And on the back, it has the United Methodist propaganda that they required us to put on it. And but anyway, they're really cozy, and feel free to grab one afterwards. We could, yeah, for some reason, I don't know where the mediums went, but we have small, large, and extra large, so hopefully you can find a cozy. You want a big one anyway, right? Yes, if you want to be part of the cult, you have to wear it every Sunday. So that is kind of scary. But that's what's going on. So let me outline real quick kind of what we're thinking about doing. Not thinking about, but what we're going to do tonight. I should probably do the welcome first. Welcome, whether you're joining us online or here live. We're glad you're here. I'll do the call to worship here in just a minute, and then I'm going to read you a short reading from a Max Lucado book that we're in this theme that we've been talking about between us and them, or beyond us and them, talking about tension between folks and groups and whatnot. And so we've talked a little bit about tension between how our political climate and our world in our country right now is very divisive, and how we kind of create conversations about that. I've jokingly said my hope is that when you show up for Thanksgiving dinner with your family, that your head doesn't explode. That's really the goal of this series, that you can have civil conversation and understand each other and hopefully move beyond these sort of us and them categories that we create. So we talked about kind of politically. Tonight we're going to talk about sort of how it works kind of in the church world as well, how this us and them thing kind of plays out. And so so whether you're a church person or not, I'm glad you're here, and hopefully you'll have stuff you can kind of take with you. But I'll read a little bit from Max Lucado, and then we're going to watch about a 4-minute video of Rachel Held Evans, and I'll introduce her when we get to that point, and she's going to talk about communion, and then we're going to take communion together, if you guys are up for that. Then I'm going to talk at you a bit, and then we'll discuss a bit, and then we'll call it a night. So, that sound all right? Good. Hi, Greg. Do you want to sit up here? Okay. Nobody wants to sit up front for some reason. That's where it is, yeah. So it's communion wine, though. There's something a little sacrilegious about that. Here's our call to worship that we normally do, and so we'll start with this, and then I'll kind of roll into what we're going to be doing tonight. God of love, plant us in the soil of your grace. Nurture us with the strength of Christ, the vine of everlasting light. Enlighten us with the wisdom of your Spirit, which flows through us today and all days. Abide in us, that we may abide in you and live in your love. We pray in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. If you're familiar with Max Lucado, he's kind of a popular writer, and I heard this actually years ago. I was at a conference in which he delivered this for the first time as part of a sermon, and I thought it was really clever and fun, and I thought it might be a good way to kind of frame the conversation about us and them in the church world as we get started. It's called Life Aboard the Fellowship. God has enlisted us in his Navy, and he's placed us on his ship. The boat has one purpose: to carry us safely to the other shore. This is not a cruise ship. This is a battleship. We aren't called to a life of leisure. We're called to a life of service. Each of us has a different task. Some concerned with those who are drowning, are snatching people from the water. Others are occupied with the enemy, so they man the cannons of prayer and worship. Still others devote themselves to the crew, feeding and training the crew members. Though different, we're all the same. Each can tell of a personal encounter with the captain. For each of us has received a personal call. He found us among the shanties of the seaport and invited us to follow him. Our faith was born at the sight of his fondness, and so we went. We each followed him across the gangplank of his grace onto the same boat. There is one captain and one destination. Though the battle is fierce, the boat is safe, for our captain is God. The ship will not sink. For that there's no concern. There is concern, however, regarding the disharmony of the crew. When we first boarded, we assumed the crew was made up of others like us, but as we've wandered these decks, we've encountered curious converts with curious appearances. Some wear uniforms we've never seen, sporting styles we've never witnessed. Why do you look the way you do, we ask them. Funny, they reply, we were about to ask the same of you. The variety of dress is not nearly as disturbing as the plethora of opinions. There's a group, for example, who clusters every morning for serious study. They promote rigid discipline and somber expressions. Serving the captain is serious business, they explain. It's no coincidence that they tend to congregate around the stern. That's a really bad dad joke, isn't it? There's another regiment deeply devoted to prayer. Not only do they believe in prayer, they believe in prayer by kneeling. For that reason, you always know where to locate them. They're at the bow of the ship. And then there are a few who staunchly believe real wine should be used in the Lord's Supper. You'll find them, of course, on the port side. Still, another group has positioned themselves near the engine. They spend hours examining the nuts and bolts of the boat. They've been known to go below deck and not come up for days. They're occasionally criticized by those who linger on top of the deck, feeling the wind in their hair and the sun in their face. It's not what you learn, those topsiders argue. It's what you feel that matters. And oh, how we tend to cluster. Something that once you're on the boat, you can't get off. Others say you'd be foolish to go overboard, but the choice is yours. Some believe you volunteer for service. Others believe you are destined for the service before the ship was even built. Some predict a storm of great tribulation will strike before dock. Others say it won't hit until we're safely ashore. There are those who speak to the captain in a personal language and those who think such languages are extinct. Those who think the officers should wear robes, those who think there should be no officers at all, and those who think we are all officers and should all wear robes. And oh, how we tend to cluster. And then there's the issue of the weekly meeting, at which the captain is thanked and his words are read, and all agree on its importance, but few agree on its nature. Some want it loud, others quiet. Some want ritual, others spontaneity. Some want to celebrate so they can meditate. Others meditate so they can celebrate. Some want a meeting for those who've gone overboard. Others want to reach those overboard without going overboard and neglecting those on board. And oh, how we tend to cluster. The consequence is a rocky boat. There's trouble on deck. Fights have broken out. Sailors have refused to speak to each other. There have even been times when one group has refused to acknowledge the presence of others on the ship. Most tragically, some adrift at sea have chosen not to board the boat because of the quarreling of the sailors. And oh, how we tend to cluster. We're going to take a minute. If you're unfamiliar with Rachel Held Evans, she was a writer who probably wrote 4 or 5, maybe 6 books in recent years, and sort of a very prominent voice in the progressive Christian movement. And then last May, May, she came back from a speaking engagement, had an infection, got really sick. She was married, had a child who who was less than a year old, and another that was like 3 years old. Came back from a speaking engagement, was sick. It's the flu or flu-like symptoms, got worse. They put her in the hospital. They gave her some antibiotics, which turned out she was allergic to, and she died. This is the really short version of it. And so it was a very tragic sort of thing. So a lot of people now sort of jokingly refer to her as Saint Rachel Held Evans because, of course, after you pass away, you know, your writings are worth more, and people seem to pay attention more to it. But this video that you're going to see was shot about a year before she passed away, and which she kind of reflects on communion, and I'm hoping to sort of tie in her thoughts about communion to what it means for us in unity, and what it means to kind of get beyond us and them. But as we watch this, and I think it's, like I say, about 4, maybe 5 minutes, pay attention, because I'm going to ask you afterwards what you picked up on and what sort of stuck out to you. Okay? Tatiana, make it happen.
So I was once asked by a group of Methodists to speak at a Methodist youth retreat. So this was going to be for junior high and high school students, about 500 junior high and high school students. And this is not really my typical group, my typical readers, my typical demographic, if you will. So I was a little nervous about it. And I reworked all of my talks and worried over the material, and before every single session, I prayed, God, just help me to do right by these kids, help me to do right by these kids, help me to do right by these kids, just help me to not screw this up. And it went okay. I gave my talks. Only a few of them slept through them. It wasn't a complete disaster. But after I did my presentations, I was asked by the Methodists to help serve communion at this event. And this was my first time ever serving communion. I had received it many times, but I had never served the bread and the wine. And so I was tasked with handing out the bread to 500 high school and junior high students. And as each one came by, I put this piece of bread in their cupped hands. And that's that position of having your hands held together, cupped, ready to receive, is a very vulnerable and one of the most sacred positions a person can have. And so as all of these junior high and high school students came up to me, I put this piece of bread in their hand, and I said, this is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. And I said it to the ones who were laughing in line with their friends, to the ones who had tears streaming down their faces. I said it to the ones who I could tell were probably the class clowns, to the ones I could tell probably got picked on in school. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. And I said it to the ones who were wearing designer jeans, the ones who showed up in their pajamas, to the ones with mischievous grins, to the ones who I could just tell were wrestling with doubts, with questions. This is Christ's body broken for you. This is Christ's body broken for you. And after I said it about 500 times, I finally got it. Oh, this is enough. This body and this blood is enough. It's not about me doing right by these kids. It's not about me impressing them. It's about getting out of the way and letting Jesus do his thing. They weren't waiting on me. Jesus was present, Jesus was there, and Jesus was enough. And that was a really powerful experience for me, serving communion for the first time and recognizing that my insufficiency is kind of the point. Right, I wasn't up to the task, but Christ was up for the task. It wasn't about me doing right by these kids, it was about Christ having already done right by them on the cross. And so that was a really powerful experience of giving communion to people. And then there's also the other side of receiving communion. And at my church, we receive communion on our knees with our hands cupped together. And the priest comes by and puts the bread in our hands and says, the body of Christ, bread of heaven. And that position of being on your knees with your hands cupped together, waiting to receive, is a difficult position for somebody like me to assume, because it's an expression of how my need, my helplessness. It's being ready to receive. And sometimes I like to think that I've got it all together and it's my job to give. But receiving communion reminds me of how desperately I need God, how desperately I need grace, how desperately I need the people kneeling next to me, even if we don't get along, even if I might perceive them to be my enemies. So having both given communion and received communion, I see it as this beautiful, powerful, and sufficient means of grace. It's an outward sign of inward grace, and it is always and ever enough. The body and blood of Christ is enough. I think the problem is sometimes we just tend to get in our own way. We make it all about ourselves. We try to impress people. We try to make it about theology. We try to make it about doctrine and denominationalism and our screwed up notions of who's in and who's out. And we get in the way of Christ and the table. And so I think the main thing is to learn to get out of the way and let God move, to keep in mind that what makes the gospel offensive isn't who it keeps out. It's not who it keeps away from the table. It's who it invites in. That's always been what makes the gospel powerful and countercultural and frankly offensive. So yeah, that's how communion has been working on me, wearing down my pride, wearing down my grudges, my hostility, slowly but surely.
Vince, what'd you hear? What struck you as Rachel talked? You guys were real chatty earlier. Well, I'll tell you why I wanted to show this video and why I thought it'd be fun to show before communion in particular. If you'll pretend to be in my shoes for a little bit, for years I've been a pastor, and almost weekly, if not weekly, we've administered the sacraments, and I watch as people come, and I hand out the bread, and they take the bread and dip it in the wine, and they eat it as the symbol of communion with God. And it's always a very profound moment for me. Frankly, it's my favorite part of the service. And then I always feel kind of guilty that I never get to share that with anybody else, to share, to be able to serve. And she talked about it's sort of a profound experience to share that with somebody else. But it's also a profound experience to receive as well, to be in a position of vulnerability, to say that I'm in need of grace, I'm in need of God in my life as well. So here's what I'm hoping you'd do, if you're game with me. Just kind of divide this room kind of in halfsies, and I have two things of communion up here. And if you could come up one at a time, or not even come up. Actually, what I'd like to do is kind of make a circle, and then as you make that circle, just serve the person next to you. And what that just means is tear off a piece of the bread, hand it to them, and say, "This is Christ's body broken for you." Simple as that. And then they take that and they'll dip it in the wine and they'll eat it. And then they'll take the bread and then go to the next person's circle till you go all the way around the circle. Does that make sense? And then, because I want you to experience both ends of that, both giving and receiving of what that's like to give and receive. So with that, let me give you this disclaimer as well. I have grape juice and gluten-free cracker over here too. If your preference is those or need is those, we'll make sure that you get what you need, Sarah, my gluten-free friend. So yeah, let's try that. Are you guys up for that? Okay, good. So yeah, we can even just maybe these two tables and then these two tables. Will that work? All right. So many of you guys. I'm going to turn my microphone off. Thank you guys for humoring me with that, and I hope that was a meaningful experience for you. Yeah, like I mentioned, we've been in this conversation. We've been talking about this idea between us and them, and how do we create ways of conversations to talk about the differences between ourselves and other people, so that we're not categorizing and thinking of people of us and them, us and them. In the midst of this, about 20 years ago, it's been that long, I was working at a church in Scottsdale, Arizona. And there was I was on staff there and it was a larger church, and so there's multiple staff people. But one of the people on staff was a guy named Jonathan Foster. He was a musician, just a really dynamic guy. And we stayed in touch over the years and became good friends and stayed in touch for long periods of time. He now lives in Kansas City, and he started a church in Kansas City area, metropolitan area in Overland Park, Kansas. And that's all gone great and everything. But as Jonathan began to kind of wrestle with different issues, and particularly around LGBT inclusion sorts of issues, the denomination that we were both part of didn't really like a lot of the questions he was asking and the way in which he was asking them. And so the really short version is that about 2 months ago, well, 3 or 4 months ago, he called me and we began to talk about these sorts of issues. And he says, I think the denomination is going to uninvite me to be a part of it. And I said, they can do that? And he said, yes, I think they're going to uninvite me and my entire church to be a part of them. And I said, well, so we talked about what that looked like and, options for what they could do going forward. But sure enough, a couple months ago, that's exactly what happened. And then in the midst of this, Jonathan had been journaling for a long period of time, and touch him, go to the next slide. He wrote a book, actually. It's a 50-page book. It's a short book. But the title of it is Questions About Sexuality That Got Me Uninvited from My Denomination. Next slide, Tay. And the one after that. There we go. Anyway, here's what he writes at the beginning of it. He said, I had some hope that the denomination would respond with genuine interest and curiosity, but as you've already gathered, that wasn't the case. My multiple questions, ones I'd like to think were formulated with an appreciation of human complexity, were met with one simplistic response. You're not in alignment with the church, and then, are you in or out? I wasn't looking to be out, I assured them. I was in. I had served in the denomination my entire life, attended undergrad and graduate schools, planted 3 churches, been invited to speak in numerous churches and universities around the country, and was in good standing with our tradition. Additionally, I was a 3rd-generation denominational pastor, which means, among other things, I had no desire to embarrass the family name. But alas, institutionalized thinking is a worthy opponent. To build upon Upton Sinclair, it's impossible to get an organization to change their mind, in particular when so much rides upon an organization not changing its mind. These sorts of situations are prevalent. They're all over the place. This happens all the time. There's these us and them sorts of divisions that come about. Into that world, Paul years ago wrote these words, accept one another then just as Christ accepted you in order to bring praise to God. So as I've been thinking about this series quite a bit, I was thinking about this quote that I heard years ago that's always kind of stuck in my craw. And it goes like this, by a guy named Gustavo Gutierrez. He's a South American theologian, but he says this, those who want to change the course of history are usually those who pose new sets of questions rather than those who often offer solutions. In other words, what he's trying to say is this, it's not helpful to have the right answer if you're asking the wrong question, right? For example, it's like the old joke about the pilot that gets on the plane and he says, hey, I've got good news and I got bad news, The bad news is we're lost. We're hopelessly lost. I have no idea where we are. We've lost all communications, and the radar's down, and we're not quite sure where we're at or where we're going. The good news is we're making great time. So it's the same kind of thing, right? If you're not, it doesn't matter how fast you're going if you don't know where you're going, and so the same is true if you're asking the wrong questions. Sometimes it doesn't matter how good your answers are. So I was thinking about that a lot the last couple of weeks, and especially in light of this conversation. And so I just want to throw out to you 3 ideas that I had about, and they're not original to me, but ways of thinking of this. 3 ideas of how we ask new questions and what that sort of looks like. So this is a little bit heady, so stick with me. You have to put your thinking cap on a little bit. But the first way of asking new questions is this. What happens if we think of Christian spirituality, Christian faith, less as a religion and more as a way? And what I mean by that is this. Early on, the very early Christians, they weren't called Christians. They didn't begin to want to start an institution or even a religion. What they were called was followers of the way. Followers of the way. In fact, you notice in Acts 22, when Paul begins when he's Saul, before he becomes Paul, and he's persecuting the church, he says exactly that. He talks about it. I persecuted the followers of the way, hounding some of them to death, arresting both men and women, throwing them into prison. This is the way they were kind of referred to early on. And the reason they were referred to that was because it was less about an organization or a religion. It was a way of doing life, following a way, because everybody has a way of doing life. They have certain guiding principles that guide us. Every one of us has this. Now, for some people, it's pretty simple. It's like, I do whatever feels good, or I take the path of least resistance, or something like that. But everybody has something that drives them in a particular way. And not all ways are created equal. Some ways of being are rooted in profound truths of how the world is. It's the way the universe exists. And you could say it's sort of the grain of the universe. For example, I'm convinced that generosity is a better way to live than being stingy. I'm convinced that forgiving people and not carrying around bitterness is the best way to live. I'm convinced that having compassion on other people is a better way to live. I'm convinced that being honest with other people is a better way to live. And everybody follows some sort of way, some sort of something that guides them along the way. And so Jesus' intention when he came to earth was to call people to live in tune, in harmony with this way, with God's way. And so Jesus would model generosity, Jesus would model compassion and forgiveness and honesty, and in doing that, he was showing us what God is like, and by extension, what the universe is like, the way in which the universe is wired and created. And so at one point, Jesus claims, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And what he was saying was, he's not saying that there's one religion that's better than all other religions. He was simply saying that his way is the way to depth of reality. His way is the best way to live. So the way of Jesus is not about religion. The way of Jesus is about reality. It's about lining yourself up with the way things are. And so the question is this. Maybe we should be asking, rather than who is right, we should be asking, who is living rightly? Who is living in the correct way? Who is the most aligned with the way of God, the way of love? And if we think of Christian faith as religion, we'll always be fighting over who's right and who's wrong. But if we think of it as a way, we don't really care about who's right and wrong. We ask, how are you embodying this way of Jesus? How are you embodying this way of love? Rather than asking who's right, we should be asking who's living rightly. So that's one way to maybe kind of think about how we ask different sets of questions. Here's another way of rethinking this. Thinking of it as a method rather than a belief. Thinking of Christian faith as a method rather than a belief. And what I mean by that is this. Most of you, I think in this room, some of you grew up Methodist, but most of you probably aren't. So I'm going to give you just like a 2-minute summary of Methodism that'll help you understand this. John, I'm looking at you, man. I assume you understand all this. But so Methodism started about 250 years ago. A guy by the name of John Wesley lived in England. Him and his brother Charles. John was a part of the Church of England, and him and his brother Charles had this sort of, I guess you could say, a burden, a concern for the blue-collar coal miners in their day. And again, this is like late 18th century, think American Revolution time. So coal miners, you can imagine what a horrible life that would be in the 18th century. And so these coal miners were sort of excluded from the Church of England because, you know, they were dirty and gross and dingy, and they didn't want them in their pretty churches. And so John and Charles had this idea, we're going to go out and we're going to start meeting with these coal miners and just have services just out in the open. And so they did that. And as they did that, this movement began to grow that they called the Methodist movement, or the Wesleyan revival. And so as it grew and became bigger, John Wesley was this sort of really great strategic mind. He just had really good ways of planning out everything. And so he was the Elizabeth Warren of the 18th century. He had a plan for everything, right? And so he structured these really cool ways of doing. And the people on the outside who are critics of John Wesley would make fun of him and say, "You've got a system and a plan for everything. You have a method for everything." And so, and they would say, "You know what you are? You're nothing more than a bunch of Methodists." And the name stuck. So there's a bit of trivia for you. That's how the name came about. So he had this way of thinking about things. And when it came to belief, the things that people believe, John Wesley was really pragmatic. He was really not very concerned about telling people what to believe, but he was really concerned with telling them how to believe. And there's a big difference. So here's what he would say. He passed on, as he died, he passed on then not a system of beliefs, but a method. Again, Methodist, right? He passed on a method. And the method was this. He said, we gather information from all around, and that sort of informs the way in which we think about the world. And the word that he used was, or he didn't use this, but his followers picked up on this later, it was the idea of what was called a quadrilateral. And I think we have a picture of this, yeah. So he says we look at the scriptures, and we read something in the Bible, and we think, oh, this is really interesting. But we don't read the Bible in a vacuum, right? I mean, we come at it from our own biases. We come at it from our own culture. We come at it from our own languages. And so we draw on our own personal experiences in the way in which we understand it. We use our brains. We use tools in education, for example, psychology and sociology and history, and all these things kind of come into bear to help us understand and interpret the Bible. The problem is, not really the problem, but what John Wesley recognized was that the world is always changing, that the body of knowledge that we sort of gather around is sort of always grows and grows and grows. So, for example, in John Wesley's day, this is how this sort of plays out in real life. In John Wesley's day, it was very acceptable. Human slavery was accepted. That's just what happened in those days. But the followers of John Wesley, after John Wesley died, they began to take this quadrilateral, and they began to reason and talk about it and bring in different research and talk about new ways of understanding the scriptures. And through that sort of evolution, they raised their hand and they said, maybe owning another human being isn't compatible with the scriptures, and that began to all change. And the Methodists said, you're right, and they made a stand about that. And then years later, in the 1960s, there was all kinds of debate that went on in the Methodist Church about should we ordain women or not. And they decided, yeah, we think this is a good idea, that perhaps we should do that, equality. It only took 1960 years, to do that. But yeah, here we are. And they recognize this is always evolving. It's always changing, right? It's a method. It's not a way. It's not a fixed system. Now, if you are existing from outside of the Christian world, or if you're not familiar with it, most churches aren't that way. Most churches are what's called confessional churches, which means that we have a static sort of set of beliefs, and you may have been part of a church, right, that has a statement of faith that say, here's the statement, you have to believe this or you can't be part of our club, right? And you look at that and you think, yeah, well, I don't know, it's kind of odd, but that's what's called a confessional church. Methodists say, no. It's not a system of belief, it's a method. We're always learning, we're always growing, that we might have new research tomorrow in psychology that's going to help frame the way in which we think about things. And so right now in the Methodist Church, as you may or may not know, the LGBT issue is a big issue, right? How do we bring new research and information and ways of seeing the world into the scriptures through experience and reason and tradition? And that becomes a framework as we dialogue about how this is constantly evolving and changing. If you see faith as a method rather than something that we're defending, then we can allow for a lot more grace on that, right? we can have a lot more conversation around that. Okay, so here's the statement on this in terms of different kind of questions to ask. We honor the saints who have gone before us, not by believing what they believed, but by asking the same kinds of questions they asked. Right? You ask the right questions, you don't have all the right answers. And if you ask the right questions, then you can continue in the conversation. It becomes a conversation rather than something that we have to go against, right? So the way in which we honor people who have gone before us is not by completely emulating everything that they did and regurgitating the sort of statements they had, but it's in asking the same kinds of questions they asked. Okay, so here's the third way. How do you ask different kinds of questions? And this comes from an author named Rob Bell. If you're familiar with Rob Bell, this is his very first book that he wrote was a book called Velvet Elvis in 2006 or something like that. And the very first chapter is called The Trampoline. Anybody ever read Velvet Elvis? Yeah. Yeah. So this is Rob Bell's The Trampoline. Thinking of things as a trampoline rather than a wall. You can go to the next slide, Tatiana. And he begins by saying, he was listening to a guy named Ken Ham who was talking about creation. And Ken Ham said this: if you deny that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days, then you are denying that Jesus ever died on the cross. And Rob Bell's like, how does that work? And so he begins to wrestle with this, and he says, people like Ken Ham and others, and lots of people, think of faith sort of like a brick wall. That each core doctrine or belief is like an individual brick that you put in a wall, and you stack one on top of the other. The problem is, in a brick wall, if you pull one of the bricks out, the whole thing can crumble, right, and fall apart. The wall may appear strong and rigid, and sturdy, but you start pulling out bricks, and it's like a game of Jenga, right? The whole thing's going to collapse. Because a brick is fixed in size, and it can't flex, it can't change, it's not dynamic at all. And so brick walls sort of become the sum of our beliefs. And God becomes as big as the walls that we create. But Rob Bell says, what if we think about belief not like a brick wall, but rather like a trampoline, like the springs of a trampoline? So if you have a trampoline and you're jumping on a trampoline, if you take one of the springs out of the trampoline still works, right? You can still jump on it. And the person, so in this analogy, if you take away one core belief, you can still love God, you can still be a Christian, and you can still flex and change. A trampoline, he says, is not something you fight over, but it's something you jump on, right? In fact, it's something you play with. It's something that brings you joy. It's something that brings you wonder. And here's what Rob Bell says in this chapter. He says, I'm far more interested in jumping than I am in arguing about whose trampoline is better. You rarely defend the things you love. You enjoy them, and you tell others about them, and you invite others to join and to enjoy them with you. So in a trampoline, or brick walls, I should say, the way a brick wall works, that is inevitably it's designed to keep people out, right? Because you have to agree with everything on the bricks exactly as they are. You can't join in. Now, many of you probably know what that feels like. Have been part of a group like that. But Jesus never asks us to have it all together. Jesus never says, get it all figured out, then come follow me. He just says, come on and jump. Come on and jump. You can jump and you can still have questions. You can jump and you can still have doubts. I have these conversations all the time with people who they'll want to meet with me and have coffee, and they'll ask me questions about this and that. And oftentimes I'll just say to them, look, if you're waiting till you got it all figured out to jump on the trampoline, you'll never jump. Just jump. Because that's the point. Jump. The invitation to jump is the invitation to follow Jesus with all of our doubts, with all of our questions with us. And so maybe, again, the way we think about questions and answers instead of rethinking the questions is this. Instead of seeking answers to all the questions, what if we realized that the questions were the point? Because at the center, at the heart of Christian faith is mystery. It's mystery. And the things that can't be put into words is part of Christian faith because our language fails us. And in fact, the minute that we're able to put into words Christian spirituality, it limits who God is, and we've lost it. We think oftentimes of mystery. When I say the word mystery, sometimes we think about it like the movies and TV, right? And in the movies and TV, at the end of the movie or at the end of the TV show, the mystery is solved, right? You know who did it. It was the butler who did it in the kitchen with the knife or whatever, right? It turns out that it was the long-lost son all along, or turns out that she is actually a he, and all of it resolves, right? And that's why we only think of mysteries. But in Christian spirituality, mystery is different than that. In Christian spirituality, mystery gives us answers that plunge us deeper and deeper into more and more questions, and it never sort of resolves. It's sort of like a pool that you dive into, and you start swimming down as deep as you possibly can, and as soon as you get down deep enough, you discover that no matter how hard or how fast you swim downward, the pool is deeper and deeper than you ever thought it was. What if instead of seeking answers to the questions, we realize that the questions were the point all along? So here's the obvious point as we wrap up. A trampoline only works when you get your feet off the ground and jump on the air and let the trampoline propel you upward. That's the only time it works. Talking about trampolines isn't jumping. It's just talking. And so the invitation to you and to me, to all of us, is to jump. It's to jump. And so we jump, and we invite others to jump with us and to live this way of life and to ask the questions and to swim into the mystery. And you don't have to know everything or know anything about the springs to know that a trampoline can bring pure joy. And so Gustavo Gutierrez says, those who change the course of history usually are those who pose a new set of questions rather than those that offer solutions. So let me finish with this. Last week, Pastor Dwayne was out of town. He asked me to fill in on a Wednesday night group that he was doing, studying. And he sent me his notes, and in the bottom of his notes, he had this thing where he says, Cathedral Covenant. And then he had this paragraph written out, and I thought, this is really good. Why have I never heard of this? So I emailed him back and go, dude, what's the Cathedral Covenant? And he said, it's something we're working on, something that we think would be really kind of a cool thing to adopt. And I said, I like it. Can I steal it? And he said, of course. And so I'm gonna read it to you because I think it's really cool. Go ahead and go to the next slide there, Tatiana. Here's what it says. It says, we are all on the journey of discipleship, all seeking to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. We're all learners and teachers. We all have gifts to share. We work to listen and to learn from each other, treating each other with respect and dignity. We're a community of grace and forgiveness, glad for our diversity and differences. Disagreements will come, but we're willing to remain part of the community and part of the conversation, so we will not walk out or close our hearts or minds. Amen. Isn't that good? Why don't you pray with me as we wrap up? God, we know that for many of us that are here, I know there's a lot of casualties of Christian faith here, of people who have been in situations in which conversations have become very us and them, in which brick walls were erected and people were put on the outside and people on the inside. And for that hurt and for that baggage, God, we bring those things to you. And we ask that somehow as we move forward, as we keep pushing forward in the conversation, that that we would be people of grace, that we'd be people who remain in the conversation, that we'd be people who are asking the right sets of questions, that we're thinking about unity in ways that are bigger than the small ways in which we've seen them in the past. God, I also just want to pray for people who are here, I know, going through just particular times of difficulty. I know for some people in this room, it's financial issues, others it's relational issues, and others who are going through a grieving process of loved ones that they've lost. We think of Karen and her family in particular that are going through that this weekend, and so we just bring those things to you. We ask that your grace and your presence would be in our hearts and in our lives, that we would be aware of how much you deeply care about us, how much you're willing to sacrifice for us, that we'd be open and receptive to the grace that you have for us. God, and for all of us as we go from this place in just a few minutes, that you'd go with us, that we'd be conduits of your grace and your love, ambassadors of your goodness to the world in which we're about to enter into. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So here's what I'm going to do. I got a couple announcements for you, and then I'm going to read a benediction to you. If you guys want to stick around, we don't normally do what we call table time, which just means that we kind of meet around the tables and we'd kind of discuss what I talk about, or whoever's talking is talking about. And we'd love to have you stick around. If you got to go, I certainly get it, and we're glad you came, and we wish you well. But just by way of announcements, oh yes, don't forget to grab a sweatshirt on your way out. Please do. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm going to do with them, frankly. And I mean, I'm sure I'll have no problem giving them away, but I'd love to have you have a souvenir from your time here tonight. Just FYI, a couple things. Next Sunday, I will not be here. Pastor Dwayne is going to be filling in for me next week, so that should be a lot of fun. If you guys haven't heard him speak, he's a good time. Serena and I are heading to the Big Apple. We're heading to New York. Serena was able to lucky enough to get a bib to run in the New York Marathon next weekend, so we're going to that. We've been planning this for a long time. It's going to be really fun, and so yeah, that's kind of what's going on next weekend. 2 weeks from tonight. We're on November 10th, we're having what we call worship night. We did this once a couple years ago, had a great time with it. So what I did was Joel and Misty and I met with the contemporary worship leaders of the downtown campus and of the Amity campus, and we said, let's collaborate on one big thing. And so we've got 3 bands, and they're going to all do different things. We've got video. It's going to be a really lot of fun. 5 o'clock, so it's our regular time, but all the other people are coming in here to join us for that. So that's going to be November 10th. That'd be a great thing to invite some other folks to as well. So that's going to be a lot of fun. That's 2 weeks from tonight. So that's the next couple of weeks. What's going on? Got some fun stuff coming down the pike. Rake Up Boise, I think, is in your program as well. That's coming up, I think, the 19th. Did I get the detail right? The 9th, yes. So that's coming up quick in a couple weekends. 2 weeks from yesterday. So if you're willing and able to help with Rake Up Boise, that would be awesome as well. Did I miss anything? Oh, daylight savings times next weekend. But when you meet at 5 o'clock, that's less urgency than when you meet in the morning. Normally, when you have a morning service, it's like, don't forget, so you can come to church. But that's next weekend, I think, daylight savings time. So that's what I got. Let me read you a benediction, and then we'll take a break. And take about a 5-minute break or 3-minute break, and then come back to table discussion if you're able to stick around. That'd be great. So hear this benediction. May the Lord God, who knitted you together in your mother's womb, continue the work of knitting you together into life and into community. For while we may be satisfied in our own simplicity, God still finds a way to shape and form us, not to fill the blank spaces with shade and dimension, and present in his creation as the masterpiece it was always intended to be. May the body of Christ be as real for us as our own physical bodies. Let us not just carry each other's pain and burdens, but also our joy and delight. Rejoice that we are not alone, but that the one who loves us runs alongside us. Go today confident in the God that created you, that his work will continue to unfold in our world. Be rooted in the love of Christ who calls us his friends, and gather strength from the giving Spirit of God to share the gospel of truth. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I hope you have a fantastic week. Thanks.